Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. But you didn't think I was going to say that. Today, thought we'd do something fun. Quite a while ago now, I think it was about 2019, I did some illustrations of the United States. I did a really big hull profile drawing of the ship and got to know her exterior fairly well. I've never been able to visit the ship, unfortunately. Now it's a little bit too late because it's been towed to Mobile, Alabama, where it's going to be prepared for reefing. They're going to be cutting parts of it off to preserve for a museum, presumably, and then they're going to sink it on purpose, which is a whole other discussion. But I thought, because it's been dominating the news, it would be good to kind of give a little bit of a glimpse and insight into what made the United States so special. Why is it such a unique ship? And truly, in the history of Oceanliner Designs, that is the design of ocean liners, not this channel, it's pretty unique. It's a pretty special ship for a number of reasons. So I thought what we'd do is have a fly around my drawing. I wanted to show you guys plans of the ship, but they're actually kind of rare and a little bit hard to come by because the US government has traditionally been quite cagey about releasing huge, sections and chunks of the ship's plans, because when it was designed and built in the 1950s, it was kind of like a secret weapon, and we'll explain why. So I'm going to fire up my drawing on this screen, and then we'll have a little look around. What do you reckon? Let's do it. So looking at the United States general proportions, we can see it's actually extremely long and fine. So the ship wasn't really that big, interestingly. And around about the time she was built in the 50s, the long-standing speed record holder was, of course, the Queen Mary, which also fortunately still exists, but she was a absolute speed demon, relying mainly on brute force to get her through the waves. She was a big 80,000 ton monster of a ship, and she was like a Bentley, extremely luxurious and with a good bit of grunt beneath the hood. Looking at the profile of the United States, this is the drawing that I did back in 2019, you can see this ship is a lot more like a Shelby Mustang. It's all raw power, baby. That's what it's all about. The ship is designed to be fairly small, but kind of really knife-like to cut through the ocean at speed. So the ship is legendary for that pace that it set. It could get across the ocean in absolutely no time at all, just a handful of days. And it could do speeds up to, it's contentious, but looking at like the 38 to 40 something knot mark, which is like getting towards, powerboat territory. But the ship was smaller than the Queen Mary. She was around about 50, 60,000 gross registered tons. So she's a fairly small ship, but she's a very effective ship at getting you across the ocean quickly, if that's what you want to do. That was her whole reason for being. So let's have a little fly around and look at some of the things on this drawing that are unique to this ship. So straight away, the bow design is pretty interesting. You've got a very pronounced rake, or very sharp angle to the bow there. So William Francis Gibbs, who was the chief naval architect behind the project, he did have a whole team of fantastic engineers that he'd worked with for a long time at his firm of Gibbs and Cox. But the team essentially came up with this form because designing an ocean liner is fairly difficult. You have to concentrate on its reason for being, which is to get somewhere quick. So this angle to the bow here is very similar to what you might have seen on Normandy or Queen Elizabeth. In fact, it's almost identical in some ways to Queen Elizabeth's bow angle. Not so much Normandy, because in the 30s, ships with a sharply raked forend like this, you'd see it straighten up below the waterline. The United States is almost like a single angle going straight down. And so this is essentially the perfect balanced form for the bow. It's ideal for like splitting the ocean like an axe and just cutting straight through it. At the same time, the angle up means that there's more ship above the waterline essentially, and it's going to reduce the amount of, dropping down into wave troughs because there's essentially just more ship to float. Nowadays on cruise ships, a lot of ships' bows you'll see flare out quite a bit at the top, and that's essentially to add more buoyancy while also being able to cut through the waves. This is how they did it back in the 50s. But you'll also see that it's a continuous foredeck. You can see that it's the forecastle deck, which is the very, the bow deck that's open to the weather, is just one level. There's no well deck, which is like on the Queen Mary, where there's essentially like a cutout Recently on the channel, we had a chat with Stephen Payne. He's a naval architect and engineer who's designed quite a few ships, including the Queen Mary 2. And we were talking about the Queen Mary 1, and he pointed out that because of that well deck, the Queen Mary would often ship a lot of water in heavy seas. You'd take tons of water from big waves right over the nose, and just by having it gathering in that well deck for even a couple of seconds, maybe a couple minutes, it would be a huge amount of weight up top that would destabilize the ship and cause it to roll. By having a completely clear forecastle deck like this one, essentially if you're shipping big waves over the nose, they will be able to disperse quicker. There's not as much of a choke point. They'll be able to clear off the ship's decks and not have that destabilizing effect. But interestingly, if we just zoom in here, you can see that Francis Gibbs and his team have essentially predicted that this ship is going to be going, pell-mell through some pretty big seas. And so they've essentially given her a giant water break right on the bow here, just behind the forecastle, that is designed specifically to split any big waves that come over the bow and make sure they don't stay on the forecastle deck at all to cause any of that destabilizing. So this is essentially like a wedge-shaped deck house on the forecastle deck that's splitting waves either side and making sure, first of all, that you're protecting the superstructure behind, which has got all the passenger public rooms and things like that in it. It's like a windshield, really. But second of all, you're not shipping huge amounts of water where you don't want it. Coming here at the superstructure, we were just talking about it. This is it. Very, very simple. Again, you can see that this ship was designed to just absolutely go ham through big waves because it's all curved, and essentially there are no big windows facing forward. The reason for this is probably more so than many ocean liners post the 1910s. This ship was clearly designed to be what you would call kind of a wet ship. If you're running at high speed through big seas, you're going to be shipping a lot of big waves over the nose. So, forward-facing windows, it's, not a great idea. You're going to be, shattering glass. Big Atlantic storms can really be very punishing to ships like this. So she's essentially really reinforced very heavily on her forward decks here, especially in the superstructure where you can see it's essentially all portholes. Portholes are very resistant to heavy waves, big impacts and things like that. They're extremely strong in ways that windows aren't. So you can see that even on the Promenade Deck, there are big windows, but they are down the ship's side, not facing forward, because that presents a potential weak point. Of course, being a post-war ship, she had all the trimmings of exciting things like radar. Until this point, ships were relying on position, direction finding radio signals and things like that, so they could triangulate their position and kind of figure out where they were. There was a little bit of that going on ships like United States, but radar was extremely useful. Coming into ports, if there was fog, anyone who's traveled on the Queen Mary 2 or been off the US coast in summer knows that fog can just appear out of nowhere and last for like an hour and then disappear. And it's pretty dangerous. And so a number of ships were lost, like the Andrea Doria, in a terrible fog bank just off Nantucket. And that's the kind of thing that, these, designers and operators of ships from this era were very keen to avoid. So fitting ships with radar like this gives them another tool. Andrea Doria did have her own radar set. That's a conversation for another day. But in theory, you'd be able to see things like icebergs. You'd be able to see icebergs from a couple miles away. So the designers of United States, it's interesting. She's got a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new. A little bit of the new in the fact you've got this giant freestanding metal radar mast, essentially, that its main purpose for being is supporting your radar, your navigational equipment, things like that. In the past, a ship would have to have a giant mast sticking up with a crow's nest, a lookout's position in it. That was typically open to the elements. But by the 50s, you've got a radar mast. And what's really cool about the United States radar mast is that it actually also has a little bit of the old. So it has a crow's nest in it. So it does have a lookout's position. You can see it, the little cab there with the windows but it's enclosed. And so, yeah, it's a very interesting ship because she's kind of at the intersect of classic, ocean liners like the Queen Mary and all those before it. And this new era where now we have, radar and all these really powerful navigational aids that can really, really help ships, crews operating vessels like this. Now, as if to prove more that she was designed to operate in very rough conditions without breaking a sweat, you can see that again all the way down the superstructure. It's all portholes. There are no big windows. It's not like the Normandy where you've got all the big, beautiful Art Deco windows looking in. It's essentially all portholes. So there were quite a few unique design choices that were made around this ship that made her extremely practical. I think she's very beautiful from the outside. I think the inside as well. I love, that mid-century kind of like modern Mad Men look. It's not for everyone. It's very minimalist, but that was the time. This was the age of minimalism and the Eames chair, so a lot of the kind of like fancy schmancy stuff, like, gilt trimmings and your carvings. Yeah, throw that stuff out. You don't need that by the 50s. What the United States lacked in trimmings, she more than made up for in impressive technical stuff. So there are a couple of records that the United States sets in terms of her speed and things like that, but I'm fairly certain she had the largest set of funnels ever fitted to a passenger ship. So these things are absolutely enormous. There are photographs of them with like cars parked around them. So United States had some pretty comprehensive boilers. She had these superheated units that were providing very, very high pressure, very hot steam to her turbines to feed these extremely powerful engines that, again, relied on brute force to go at a very fast pace. So the Babs and Wilcox boilers, I believe, needed to obviously get rid of a ton of gases. They needed a lot of ventilation. So a lot of the United States upper works are devoted to forced draft, so fan mechanisms that are essentially bringing in fresh air and funneling it down into the boiler and the engine rooms. So United States funnels really are key to this entire system. And you can actually see at the base of the funnels these big grill mouths that are all over the ship. So in the generation prior to this, you would have had, big vents, big stokehold vents, they're called, cowl vents, things like that. Like the Queen Mary was covered in all these vents. And ships had always been covered in big vents like that. But around about the late 30s, there's a change. Designers realize, actually, we don't need to chew up deck space by having these big ventilators around. We can actually house the fans in deck houses on the upper works and just kind of like put grills there. It would have resulted in kind of like a loud experience walking around the ship. Walking past these vents, if you were doing a promenade, you would have heard them constantly drawing air in. So there would have been just a buzz of ventilation all around the ship all the time. But it's really interesting seeing this evolution of ship design. Gone are the forest of vents like you would have seen on Aquitania, for example. Aquitania is a great example where she's just got like dozens and dozens of these hilariously oversized vents. United States is very clean because they could get rid of it by that point. But these funnels are beautiful. These big, tall, monstrous things that really give her silhouette the finish that it needed to show that this was a ship that was going somewhere. Looking back there, the second funnel deck house, you can see more of the vents that I was talking about. But between the funnels, there's not a whole lot going on. And this is kind of the benefit of having, this new technology, fan technology, things like that. You can have a kind of like a clear upper works. You can have more deck space. So the area between the two funnels was a fairly large sports deck that was open air, which is really cool. There's a little clue that shows that this was a sports deck. Anyone who, again, has been on a cruise anywhere or a transatlantic crossing knows it can get pretty windy. So the ocean and the elements already, they produce some pretty full-on conditions, a lot of wind, a lot of sea spray and things like that. So say the wind can already be moving at, say a 30 knot wind or a 20 knot wind, something quite strong, good breeze. The United States is already moving at 30 knots. So those combined, breeze, if it's coming from head on, plus the ship's natural speed is creating that breeze coming back, you would have a combined 60 knot headwind. It's quite a bit. So the United States is covered in these little shields, essentially windshields. So you can actually just see one right there and right there. They create, they just deflect the wind. It's just a little thoughtful thing for passengers so they don't get blown away when they're trying to play deck tennis or something like that. It was something that William Francis Gibbs and his design team had done a lot on previous liners. So the SS America had a few of these around, and they would just strategically place them in high volume or high traffic areas where passengers would be expected to go walking or relax or that kind of thing. So you have these big windshields, essentially just protecting your passengers, making sure they don't get blown to smithereens. Of course, the boat deck has to be fairly clear, fairly clutter-free, because you are boarding lifeboats from there. So there aren't so many of those on the boat deck, interestingly. So going for a stroll on the boat deck is good luck to you. Have fun, because you will probably be blown away. But there are also a lot of entrances there. You can see a lot of these like things here. Stairs going there. Stairs going down there. They have little deck houses, covered deck houses, so passengers could get in and out nice and easily without getting, the elements inside the ship. Inadvertently, they create little nooks and crannies which the wind is less likely to impact. So typically, you would have seen people kind of on a windy day, if they were putting their deck chairs up along the boat deck, they would be cramming them in behind entrances and staircases like that to protect them from the wind. Of course, the best thing that you could do is enjoy a nice long walk around the ship's full wrap around inside promenade. And I love a covered inside promenade deck. They are just so uniquely shippy, and the United States had a really, really beautiful one. So you can see the big floor-to-ceiling windows down here were for the inside covered promenade, and they don't make them anymore, and it makes me upset. If you go and stay on the Queen Mary in Long Beach, you'll see snippets of this very unique space where it's decked like the outside of the ship on the floor, but with these big windows. And so even if you're in the middle of the North Atlantic in winter, if you just get the slightest bit of sun, it gets very, very cozy and very warm in these open promenade decks, and they're really nice and relaxing. So you would have had a ton of deck chairs in here, people relaxing, they're out of the elements, but you have a spectacular view of the ocean as it goes past. What's really interesting about this little snippet of the hull here is that you can see just how small the superstructure is. The United States is almost all hull. She's a giant speedboat with a very small superstructure on top. Because again, she's not a very big ship. She's got a similar tonnage, a similar internal volume to ships, 30 odd years earlier than her. So she's really built for speed, probably a little bit at the expense of like passenger number of amenities. But then again, do you need 3 Winter Garden style casual areas to sell tickets? No, the selling point for this was, you want to go to Paris for your holidays, we can get you there in 3 days, 4 days, whatever. It's pretty impressive stuff. So a lot of thought was given to safety on this ship. This ship came at the tail end of a huge amount of, shall we say, spicy maritime moments. The design team was obsessed with fire. They were horrified by what had happened to the Morro Castle, which was all wood-panelled, nicely veneered. Of course, that veneer resulted in a absolutely cracking inferno that burnt the ship through and through. So, very famously, William Francis Gibbs forbade the installation of almost any timber aboard his ship. He also oversaw the installation of a monumental amount of asbestos, which was a lot of fun when they had to take that out, I think in the 90s. But, at the time it was the wonder material that would prevent fires. But the ship's lifeboats as well, they're up on big gravity davits that are quite modern. They've all got winches. They're all motorized. the davits are motorized. I think the boats still relied on a Fleming gear, which is a passenger-powered device, but it meant that the boats could still get through the water on their own power without needing oars, which is very cool. But even better, they're all made of metal. They're not wooden boats like you would have had on the likes of Titanic. No, these are all very big, very powerful boats, but they're still open-topped, as was the style at the time. And I just don't know why it took so long for ships designers and operators to realize, hey, maybe we should put a cover on these or put a roof on for passenger comfort. I don't know. But of course, nowadays, ships' lifeboats are made with roofs, with compartments, things like that. Now, lifeboats are all well and good, but worst case scenario, if something goes very, very wrong with your ship and it goes down very quickly, it might be good to have something like a raft. And so the United States is covered in these little floats. They're almost like Carly floats that you would have found on warships in the Second World War. Really, they're a last resort, and actually, I'm pretty sure they're self-deploying. So if the ship sank, then the floats would essentially just rocket to the surface, and at least you'd have something for people to hold on to. But also, the ship was absolutely covered in fire stations, and you can just see one at the base of the funnel here. If we zoom in, that is fire station number 11 behind that little ladder there. So again, being so terrified of the concept of a fire destroying your ship, William Francis Gibbs and his team absolutely festooned the United States with reels and hoses that were connected to very extensive pumping systems that could, back in the day, the systems were designed for pressure to be maintained if you needed 3, maybe 4 hoses at a time. Obviously, that wasn't good enough because it meant when ships like the Morro Castle burnt and you had 10 stations working at the same time, there was no water pressure and it came out in a dribble, and that was not useful for anybody. So the United States was designed to provide quite a lot of water pressure on quite a number of hydrants, and she was covered in them, just in case. Of course, her ultimate secret reason for being was to serve as a troop ship in the event of open hostilities in Europe. So the United States would have been able to ship thousands of men, avoid air attacks and avoid submarine attacks, relying purely on her speed to get across the North Atlantic. And so that was really her secret reason for being, which also explains a lot of this kind of obsession with safety. Now we're behind the second funnel. We're at the back end of the ship. We can see a big block of fans up here. There's a huge need to get as much air down inside the ship as possible. But of course, it's also air conditioned. So this is around about the time that air conditioning plant becomes standard on big passenger ships. Before then, if it was summer and you were stopped, there was really nothing they could do. They could put some electric fans in, but you couldn't cool the air. You could heat it, but you couldn't cool it. And now, of course, the advent of air conditioning means that ships like the United States have a very comprehensive air conditioning plant. It means that everybody can stay nice and cool. Cool, so back here, this is the stern of the ship. So you can see just how clever they have been in keeping the ship's upper works very clear and open and free of clutter. This drawing was relatively easy-ish to do because I didn't have to spend all that time figuring out what all these different vents and bits of equipment look like, because she hardly had any, So you can just see here that there is a passenger sports deck, again, just behind the king post here. So the king post is this tall mast-looking thing. King posts were essentially just a stationary boom by which they could attach derricks, boom arms, to pick up cargo and load it into the ship. So you do have cargo hatches around here. The cargo hatch lids were actually motorized, I believe, and they could open up and shut, which was very cool for a ship like this, because traditionally the crew would have to, unlatch the cargo hatch, lift it up with a whole bunch of them, get out of the way. It was a lot of work. Having motorized cargo hatches was quite a useful thing because it could speed up by a little bit, the cargo lowering and unloading process. But by having your cargo handling stuff on its own little island here, it keeps the rest of the deck clean and clear for passengers. And this is kind of the thing that ship designers of the past weren't even worried or thinking about. Even the Queen Mary on some of her passenger spaces forward has big cargo booms all over the place and winches and all that kind of thing. Passengers weren't allowed up here. This is not a passenger space. So that's where all the equipment is. It's elevated above your head. That means the deck that you're walking on is nice and open and you can enjoy all the space. And then looking down here, you really get a sense of just how fine this ship is, how big her propellers are in relation to her size, and just how I think it's a very attractive looking design. It's very aesthetically pleasing, but it has a lot in common with battleships. So she has, as you can see there, this was fairly common by this point on ships, but she's got a balanced warship style rudder. And it's not really a coincidence. The United States development was aided immensely by development of ships like the Iowa class battleships and things like that. Massachusetts and other classes of battleships alongside that used things like superheated boilers, used things like balanced rudders, used alternating 4, 5, 6 blade propeller designs. It was a very heady, exciting time to be a designer of ships, I would imagine, working for the US government. And so all the lessons that were essentially taken from, these fast battleships and ships like them during the Second World War, destroyers that were able to test superheated boilers and things like that, were then funneled into projects like the United States. But again, it's just so funny seeing a ship so clear of equipment. You can see there's absolutely nothing on the stern there to get in the way, versus if you compared that with the likes of, Queen Mary, where there's a ton of equipment, tons of bits of mooring equipment. What's really clever about the United States is all that mooring equipment, all the equipment you'd use to actually secure the ship to shore or to a dock, is actually down here. You can see there's these little cutouts in the hull where you would have fair leads and rollers to actually put the lines through and secure the ship. It was a very effective system because it kept all that stuff that would clutter your ship out of the way of passengers. And so really, for the first time around about this generation of ship, passenger comfort and passenger usage of space on the outside of the ship is really being taken into consideration. Typically, as the passenger, you'd have to work around things like winches, things like vents. But no, around about this time, they're thinking, hey, what if we hid all this stuff away and enclosed it in spaces? The Normandy did it quite effectively. The United States did it very, very well. What's really cool here is that you can see the United States has markings for her propellers. So, tugboat captains and the like would be used to being at the stern end of a ship, the after end, and trying to be clear of the props. But what's interesting is, of course, the United States, she's quadruple screwed, so she's got 4 of them. The first set of props are very, very far forward, so it's good that they've actually taken the moment to mark out on the hull where the props are. Of course, if your propellers start churning, it can cause some damage. It can suck ships in, small tugboats and things like that, bash them up against the hull. It's unlikely that warning really did much as far as warning other ships. It's more likely that it's something to do with insurance, so liability in the case. Often tugboats were complaining about being damaged by the ship that they were meant to be escorting, that the propellers came on and sucked them in. And, it may have been a way for shipping companies to kind of protect themselves from that kind of claim. Another interesting thing is the extensive usage of sacrificial anodes. So I don't think we've really talked about anodes much on the channel, but essentially all big ships have them one way or another. You can see them down here. They're usually made of zinc. And essentially the very kindergarten explanation, which I'm able to give because I'm not a chemical scientist, is that the manganese bronze of your propellers is likely to have some corrosion with time. It takes a long time to completely break down bronze, but the other elements on your propeller, like steel caps, steel hubs, and things like that, it can cause corrosion around the area of the props. So by having zinc anodes there, essentially what happens is the anodes, which are sacrificial, they're temporary, they corrode. They essentially cop the damage, they cop the corrosion, and it lessens the impact on critical core components like propellers and things like that, the wings, the hull, that kind of thing, which is quite clever. So typically, even Titanic had big zinc sacrificial anodes for that very reason, to slow down the corrosion of like steel components on the propellers, the bronze, that kind of thing. And small boats have it. All boats of all size use sacrificial anodes, so they're a very useful bit of kit. But it's funny to see something on a 50,000 ton ocean liner that you would also see on a 20-foot fishing boat. It's doesn't matter the size. It just works. It just works. All in all, she's a very beautiful ship. The United States, I think, has one of the most attractive and unique ocean liner silhouettes through history. She's very clear. She would have been probably a joy to be on as a passenger. I think that a lot of thought was given to your comfort levels, what you'd be doing with your time. I think it's sad to see her go. I think it would have been great to see this ship restored and function similarly to how the pier that Google operates out of in Chelsea. That would have been fantastic. Something like that, corporate spaces, shared working spaces, food halls, that kind of thing. Maybe it's not too late. I think there are some efforts to raise awareness and rush in to try and help the United States and prevent her from being sunk. I know that there's a New York coalition to save the United States. I think they've got a petition, and I'll see if we can add a link in the description below if you're interested in helping out there. It does look like it's going to be an uphill battle because, United States has already arrived at Mobile and she's going to be dismantled very soon. But in theory, apparently, according to the concept renders of the museum, the radar mast, part of the bridge, and the forward funnel, I think they're planning on cutting off and restoring and keeping as part of a land-based museum. So even if the ship does get sunk, in theory, you will be able to walk some of her decks into the future. So there you have it. That's a little overview of the United States. Deck plans and things like that give you a much better insight into what the ship was actually like on the inside, but it's very interesting going over the outside of these ships because there's so much character here that makes the United States so unique and truly a fun ship. And this was a really fun drawing to do. If you're interested in the drawing, it's available on my website. I'll include a link in the description below as well. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.